So, what does it really mean to sacrifice everything for God? Well, we're about to explore that very question. We're going to dive into this really fascinating and honestly pretty intense 1982 sermon from the Reverend Myung Moon. It lays out this incredibly radical vision of faith, one that demands total commitment. And in this explainer, we're going to unpack its core ideas right now. Okay, so the sermon kicks off with this really powerful, kind of counterintuitive question. It immediately challenges how, most of us think about prayer. Instead of asking God for help, it suggests that true love means you want to give help to God. It's the simple flip that just sets the stage for everything that follows. It really makes you ask, in the relationship with God, who's the one that's truly in need? So that brings us to the first big theme, which is all about the nature of true love. The sermon basically argues that for your love of God to be real, it can't just be some abstract idea you think about on a Sunday. No, it has to be tangible, active, and constant, something you are living, every single moment of every day. And the sermon makes a really sharp distinction here. On one side, you've got what it calls conceptual love, the passive, occasional kind of love where you just think about God sometimes. But then on the other side, there's realistic love. And this is presented as something you feel with every single breath, a constant state of giving that's supposed to be as real and tangible as a parent holding their own child. And to make this idea super concrete, the sermon uses this incredibly powerful analogy of a parent's love. It's a love that literally has no room for rejection. I mean, think about it. It doesn't matter if your kid has a runny nose, is drooling, has dirty diapers. You just love them. The love is absolute. And that is the exact standard of love being demanded for God, a love that's completely beyond judgment or any conditions whatsoever. All right, so if that's how love is defined as this total unconditional giving, then it naturally leads to the next big theme, the test of sacrifice. Because after all, a level of devotion like that has to be proven, right? And the sermon, well, it lays out exactly what that price is. This is really where the sermon pivots from just feeling to actually doing. It argues that, hey, it's not enough to simply think about this intense love for God. True faith is measured by action. The real test isn't what's in your head, it's about what you're willing to actually give up. And you can see here, the demands just escalate dramatically. It starts with your possessions, and we mean all of them. Then your company, then your entire country. But it doesn't stop there. The ultimate test, the final sacrifice that's demanded, is your most intimate relationships, your spouse, and even your own children. The message is clear. Everything must be secondary to God. To really make this concrete, the sermon throws down a direct challenge to the 300 people who are actually in the room. It asks them, would you be willing to work with all of your earnings dedicated to the church's mission for God? And the implication is, well, it's stark. If they refuse, it means their collective worth is something they're just not willing to give up. It's a really provocative way to illustrate what the sermon sees as insufficient devotion. But why? Why demand such an immense sacrifice? Well, to give it all a purpose, the sermon frames the entire movement within this grand historical narrative. It draws a direct parallel to the biblical story of the Exodus, and in doing so, it elevates their whole struggle into something epic and divinely ordained. So, according to the sermon, the followers aren't just part of some modern church. No, they're actually reenacting one of history's most epic journeys. Their struggles, that's just a necessary period in the wilderness, a 40-year trial on a global scale, all of it leading them toward a new promised land. And this lays out the whole analogy with incredible clarity. The church members, they're the new Israelites. Reverend Moon, he's their Moses. But check out those final two rows, because this is where it gets really interesting. The great obstacle they have to cross, their Red Sea, is identified as communism, and the promised land they have to reach is Moscow. So, this whole historical framework leads directly to a very concrete, real-world mission. This isn't just a spiritual journey of self-improvement anymore. Suddenly, it's an ideological and political battle with a very clearly defined enemy and, let's be honest, an incredibly audacious goal. The goal laid out in the sermon is completely explicit. Confront and overcome communism, which it calls the red ideology. I mean, this positions the entire movement right at the very heart of the Cold War. It gives its members this huge world historical task to accomplish. And to frame such a daunting task, the sermon pulls out another powerful biblical story, David and Goliath. The followers are told to see themselves as David, facing the giant of communism. The message is clear. With absolute faith, with an attitude of just serving God, even an overwhelmingly powerful enemy can be defeated. But here's the catch. The sermon stresses that they have to achieve this monumental victory completely alone. They're told, do not expect any help from the outside world, not even from so-called secular America. They have to rely only on their own faith and on their leader. So if that's the mission, what kind of person does it take to actually see it through? This final section of the sermon outlines the exact mindset required of a true follower. And let me tell you, it is absolute. Yeah, and this is where the language becomes explicitly militaristic. Followers are literally called soldiers of heaven. They're told that a good soldier doesn't think, doesn't question, they just work toward the victorious objective. And they must trust the captain's judgment absolutely. In short, it's a call for total, unquestioning obedience. To model this kind of behavior, the sermon gives a personal anecdote from Reverend Moon himself. He recounts being called by God while he was literally on his way to get food for his starving family. And he says he dropped everything right then and there and immediately followed the command. This single act of instantaneous sacrificial obedience is presented as the foundational moment, the thing that allowed the Unification Church to even be born. But there's a really fascinating paradox here. This absolute obedience, it can't be forced. The sermon concludes that the only chance for success is if each and every follower wants to go on their own. The choice has to come from a deep, internal desire to embrace this incredibly difficult journey, no matter who or what opposes them. And so that leaves us right back where we started, with the central question posed by this entire sermon. It paints a picture of a faith that is absolutely all-consuming, one that demands everything from its followers, their property, their country, their families, and even their own individual judgment. So it makes you wonder, what happens when faith requires the sacrifice of absolutely everything? That is the question at the very heart of this text.